The following presentation was made at the Opryland Hotel in Nashville, Tennessee for CALLERLAB's 16th Annual Convention, 1989.
Take a seat, gentlemen. Let's have at it.
Good morning. This is the Browning A room, and the subject is programming, for those of you who may have found the wrong room. We are pleased to see so many of you manage to wake up and come to share our information on programming. We have three of us to share with you what we know and what we've learned, sometimes the hard way, about programming. And I'd like to introduce our panelists to you. The first gentleman on my left is Shawn Cuddy from Hudson, Massachusetts. And Shawn is a caller who's started calling at about the same age I started calling. I've been calling 40 years, and I'll let you deduce what you wish from that. It turns out that all three of us started calling at about that age, and have been at it for some time, but Shawn, in the meantime, has managed to get an education in the field of design and understands some different aspects of the art of programming. And I have said many times that for me, programming is the art of calling square dancing. The mechanics, the skills, the tools that we bring to it, learning to resolve squares and to do timing and to find interesting choreography, all of those are the tools. But what you do with them is the art, and that's programming. Shawn will be talking to you about that aspect of it. Jim Lee from Canada. Where in Canada exactly? Ontario, I know, but do I have to be more specific than that? Is there a town?
Just north of Toronto.
Just north of... He won't tell me where he's from. I see. But Jim Lee occasionally comes into the States in spite of the horrendous difficulty that our government makes that for Canadians trying to come and call. We don't make them welcome, I'm sorry to say. The Canadians have a little intricacy when Americans, United States callers go to Canada, but it's nothing compared to what the United States does for Canadians. We're glad you were able to make it across the border this time and come to share with us. Jim also does more festival calling than either Shawn or myself, and will share with you his views on programming as well. To start off, we're going to let Shawn talk to you about the art and about some interesting attitudes toward that you may not have thought about as you decide which calls from the program you're going to use tonight. We think there's more to it than that, and without further discussion, we'll let Shawn push the buttons on the slide projector and have at it.
All right. Good morning. Can programming help us attain a focus when we are calling? That is, will it help me achieve my objectives? What objectives do I have when I begin to call to a floor of dancers? Do I want to teach them something, or do I want to entertain them? Do I want to do both? Can programming our dances and workshops help us entertain our dancers? Can it help me improve my performance so that my dancers will be more successful in the dance? Do I make use of all the tools available to me as a caller? Do I offer a well-rounded program? Should I? Can programming improve my teaching techniques? Do I recognize what entertains the dancers in front of me, and do I give it to them? What is it about what I do that the dancers find appealing? A look at the art of programming will help you to better assess your objectives and the dancer's needs. If programming is important, maybe we should consider what kind of art programming is. It's difficult to determine if something is an art because most of us, when thinking about art, reduce it to its superficial appearance. We seldom consider the underlying motives and concepts with which the artist approaches the creative process. The majority of us look at something and make the statement, "This is art." Many of us have a gut feeling about the subject situated in front of us, and within a split second, we come to a conclusion about its relationship to us on a personal level. I'm talking about perception and the act of thinking about what is within our field of perception. Our cognitive processes are highly efficient in receiving information and abstracting some type of conclusion. This is an amazing feat, and we do it every day, constantly, and somewhat unconsciously. Suddenly, we regurgitate a response. I like it, I don't like it. That has a nice quality to it, or that feels sinuous to me. So for many of us confronted with visual monstrosities, art is a matter of opinion and is dealt with on an intuitive level. If I'm going to establish the importance of something as an art, in this case the programming of our square dances, it will become important for you to understand just what goes into that split-second assimilation. Understanding the breakdown of this thought process will make it easier for us to see the art in what we do. There are three attitudes involved in visual perception. The first attitude we could employ is approaching something with the context in mind. We look at it and say, where is it? We look for an environment to make sense of what it is we are confronted with. Everything in this world presents itself in context and is modulated by that context. So we can say that perception involves problem solving. We look for the local atmosphere because it will give us clues to determine the artist's intent and representation. Sometimes we just look because we enjoy being stimulated. The second attitude we could employ in our approach is that of determining the true object. That is, we recognize the context or the local effects and strip it away from the focal point to establish its true character or of the object. This is the traditional practical method of thinking. We study its form, asking ourselves, what is it? What has the artist depicted here? The third attitude we could employ in our approach is an aesthetic attitude. This attitude acknowledges the context and the object, but does so by looking at the influences one has on the other, the context over the object, and vice versa, the object over the context. This third attitude is focused on the transitional aspects of what is visually confronting us, and sees the object as unfolding, sort of like the way the murderer's character is skillfully revealed to us in a mystery. We see the object the same way that the second attitude. However, the approach allows us to create concepts. Why did the murderer do it? He did it because he was a product of his environment, driven to the breaking point by a partner who was, etc. This is quite different from traditional logic and of a high general level. Here, within this white field, we assemble the individual rows into the elements into individual rows and determine that their relationship suggests an implied movement, a sense of depth, or a relief, a perspective. I could even say I feel a bounce here. We have unified these elements into a relative whole. As a caller, I'm suggesting that this should be a major focus of our efforts. We should be consciously employing the elements available to us to create a unified whole or precise communication. Before we go on, let's review what's involved. The three attitudes of perception involve a focus on the context or environment, the object or its true character, and the transitional or subtractive attitude of appreciation. If we apply context, object, and transitional focuses to the role of the caller, we might develop a breakdown of our character as follows. The caller assumes the character of the host, where the focus is on the atmosphere. The character of the craftsperson, where the focus is on our choreography. And the character of the performer, where our focus is on the aesthetic balance between the atmosphere and the choreography. As a host or master of ceremony, the caller's focus is on the context within which we will create. The caller is warm and welcoming, generating a pleasant atmosphere conducive to the building of friendships. This could be seen as priming our canvas. He or she is concerned with the dancer's immediate needs, including the quality of air, the availability of water, refreshment and restroom facilities, and that the lighting and temperature are satisfactory. Sometimes this concern is shared with the hosting club or our partner. As a programmer, the caller recognizes the need to make the space conducive to conveying information, that the acoustics are acceptable, that the forum is conducive to a social experience. As a craftsperson, the caller's focus is on the object. The caller exhibits an intimate relationship with his craft, conveying concepts and working through the medium's language. This is the caller studying the form, portraying and molding his image. The object for us, then, is choreography. The caller believes that the individual calls are the nuts and bolts of his composition, in the way that English grammar is the nuts and bolts for our great literature. The craftsperson in us believes we are creating great literature. Some of us are masters at breaking down the elements of choreography to find root words. Using these root words, we create choreography and even find humor in the way that we string them together. So the caller, as a craftsperson, revels in this process of concepts. The caller enjoys the mental challenges that choreography provides. As a programmer, the caller acknowledges complexity and tries to find a harmony of extremes. As a performer, the caller works on a highly intuitive and conceptual plane, portraying the height and breadth of the character as he or she travels through a situation. The character for us may be assumed in the content of the singing call. I could employ an accent and be Joel Grey singing cabaret, or the character may in fact be a reflection of the dancers in front of us. We move them through this board game or maze and celebrate with them with an exuberant "a la man left" when they successfully get to their corners. The story, or the hoedown, for the programmer has dramatic highs and lows, creating the interest in following the character through to the story's conclusion. The drama's climaxes and relative plateaus are depicted with varying levels of intensity. Varying levels of intensity alleviate monotony and emphasize the appeal of constant change. These constant transitions provide our dancers with variety, piquing their interest in the evolution that is taking place. We accomplish this task by using our innate exhibitory and expressive talents. Currently, most of us as programmers do this part of our job intuitively, utilizing theatrics and theatrical timing. I would suggest here that as programmers, we should be concerned with techniques of expression and not simply intuitive displays. We address our audience with a sense of empathy, believing that they will recognize or identify with the sentiment or intensity we choose to communicate. As programmers, we should recognize that this sense of empathy is reciprocal. Our dancers want us to be successful. They want to go along with the fantasy of the character. When your dancers are identifying with your sentiment, they see themselves in your projection. The astute programmer acknowledges this communal recognition of identity with the projected sentiment, "Hey, look what we've got, join us." This is in part how you feel out the floor, to compassionately guide your dancers and encourage their enthusiasm to give your dance the dramatic climaxes. You are feeling for their pulse, gauging it for its potential milking. Hopefully at this point, many of you will recognize that all of these attributes make up the total caller. We should also realize that we have individual aptitudes for certain focuses, and we tend to gravitate towards what seems natural and primary. Acknowledging our strengths and weaknesses will allow us to make some conscious connections as to our individual approaches to programming. Refusing to acknowledge the existence of these focuses leaves your program a third depleted, not only in content but in dancer interest. Taken to the extreme, this could be considered and perceived abusive to the dancer and to the whole of our activity. The first priority of the programmer, then, is to seek control over the three guises and their respective focuses. Blatantly, the issue here is control, conscious control of the atmospheric square dance, the choreography, and the pulse of our audience as they dance. We should be striving to find the reason behind the major and minute decisions that we make. These decisions, no matter what the size, have an equal influential impact over our total evening's dance program and ultimately on the success of our total activity. The programmer's objective is to create a positive perceptual experience for his or her audience. How do we do this? Well, we can begin by understanding this truism. Art explains, entertainment exploits. Let me explain. Usually people look to art to relay some kind of concept or idea. They are looking for some type of explanation, say, for example, the reason for existence. Why are we here? Why are we here? The answers to these questions are not readily available and may demand additional research into the artist's background, ideas, and body of work. The digging that one must go to do to conclude that this artist believes we are here because also explains why visits to the art museum are not a favorite pastime of our society. Their need for instant gratification on an intellectual or entertainment level is not fulfilled. People seek entertainment as a diversion, an alternative to the serious issues involved in their everyday life. Think about one of our biggest competitors for recreation time for a moment, the movies. When you make the decision to attend a movie, what you are really saying is, I want to escape momentarily from the everyday or the real and spend some time in fantasy, adventure, etc. Now think about what happens when you enter the theater. The first sensory perception, believe it or not, that you might experience is the sense of smell. You smell popcorn. The second sensory perception you might notice, more so if you hadn't seen any previews or commercials, is the graphics depicting the spectaculars that you could invest your money in. After paying for your ticket and purchasing some tasty snacks, you enter the auditorium to take a comfortable seat with a view of the screen that is suitable for our individual eyesights, because we do need to focus. By now your eyes have adjusted to the partially dimmed auditorium, creating an intimate atmosphere for us to experience the spectacular independently. You might then recognize music playing in the background, usually corresponding to the theme of the movie or the demographic audience appeal. The music fades out, the lights go to black, the cameras start projecting light, and the amplifiers start bombarding sounds at you. Your eyes and ears are now involved as you become voluntarily immersed in a hopefully pleasurable and emotional experience. All of this happens before the director of the film can present you with an additional context, taking you out of your seat and on the adventure. You may even walk away from the movie with some type of logical enlightenment. We do enjoy having our senses exploited. As programmers, we should recognize the value in this truism. Art explains for those who seek. Entertainment exploits for those who seek. Am I suggesting that we change our focus from choreography to atmosphere? In a room full of callers? Not in your life. In a room full of programmers? Maybe. In a room full of communicators? Definitely. We need to recognize that there is a range of focuses in our audience, and that they will gravitate to and respond to their personal aptitudes. So if we're going to entertain them, we have to temper our own individual focal interests for their enjoyment. As programmers, it's not surprising that we find our audience with similar focuses. Thank goodness, it makes it so much easier for us to program for their pleasurable experience. Their interest is in the context, attending a square dance. They have an interest in our object, the dance, and they have an aesthetic interest in the transitions of the spectacular. When the dancers enter our hall under the assumed guise of a tourist, their interest is in the atmosphere. It is where it's at. The tourist finds the environment to be part of what he or she finds appealing in our activity. They derive great pleasure from the local effects, the comfort and warm feeling of the wood floor, the sight of colorful costumes, the smell of coffee, the pleasant sounds and rhythms of our music, and the caring touch of others around them. The tourist enjoys being a guest and views the entire experience as a whole. They make no attempt to evaluate the parts that make up this experience, unless something causes them to focus on something that is missing or different to what they are accustomed to. For the most part, they just know that they've had a great time. These people are there strictly for a social. They come to meet people and interact. And you can recognize a social crowd when you put the needle down on your record and they are slow to get up into squares. Or worse, they talk through the entire set. The students who enter our hall do not enter because of the atmosphere. They enter because they love the actual art. The object or the choreography appeals to them. They are looking for a mental exercise and possibly some physical exercise, finding our activity to nurture their health and endurance. You can recognize these dancers easily. They get into squares promptly and are somewhat put out by these tourists who are slow to get up, admittedly exclaiming, "I can't understand why people would come to a dance and not dance. I come to dance." And at the end of this tip, these folks are the last to sit down, busily trying to express to one another what it was they found amusing in the choreography and each other's performance. Attention to your micro-programming is the secret to satisfying these dancers. The final dancer to enter our hall is the willing participant. This is the part of our audience with an aesthetic attitude. They are amused by theatrics, appreciating the expressive talents of the caller, by the timing and the level of complexity we wheel, and they have an appreciation for our efforts at making them feel at home. They appreciate the infinite and often profound and puzzling changes that our activity undergoes, seeking an extraordinary enlightenment of spectacle. They love the theme. These are the folks that want to get on this contraption and be taken on a journey. You can recognize these people by their awe-inspired and often constructive comments. "Gee, you have a wonderful voice. We really enjoyed what you did with us out there, but it was too loud." Again, be sure to understand that these attributes make up the total dancer. They will also gravitate towards a particular pole. Recognizing the majority in your audience will assist you in programming a successful dance. Is there an underlying structure to our programs? Graphically, what does programming for all these audiences look like? As a host, programming for my atmospheric dancers, naturally I would be concerned with the parameters of each tip within my entire evening. Here, I would program the length of each tip as well as the length of the rest time intervals. Here, the size of the block and the space between them represent my concern for the dancer's physical activity and rest times, much like the time slots you look for in your TV guide. The spaces between the slots are actually the commercials within your program. If they are a social group, I will probably give them longer breaks than if I discover they are of the mental exercise mode. Here, I have filled in the slots with varying lengths of lines, consisting of nonsense characters. I have done this to represent the compositions that we create within each tip. Here, as a craftsperson where my focus is choreography, I will focus on the micro-programming and the theming of each tip based on my students' needs. This is the actual script that is delivered. Here, I get to tell my story with the choreography, the nuts and bolts of my composition. The mental modules and the get-ins, the get-outs are presented to the dancer. Now, as a performer where my focus is on aesthetics comes into play, I will suggest that the orientation of my focus will change approximately 90 degrees. For now, I am using my empathetic powers. here to gauge the dancer's pulse, their enthusiasm for the concept that I have chosen to focus on. I build a level of excitement and complexity within each tip. Finally, the programmer in me, who is seeking control over the climaxes and plateaus of the entire dance, plots the activity of the floor's pulse and continues to design for the dancer's enjoyment, considering the context, the object, the transitional within the total composition of experience. At this point, I'd like to give Jim Mayo the opportunity to present the factors presentation of our program.
Thank you, Shawn. The ideas that Shawn has expressed were new to me when I first started talking with him about them, and I have been interested, as we've worked out what you've just seen, to find that I had a new point of view. One of the aspects of what he was saying that hadn't occurred to me is that as the dancers come through the door, some of how they react with us is based on what they know about us or what they know about the group that they're visiting. And these aspects I hadn't noticed before. I tend to think I'm in charge here, and I plan the program, and I'll tell them what to do, and that's all there is to it. Shawn has made me be aware that there's more to it than that, and that I need to be more aware of what the dancers are thinking as they come through the door. But I'd like to move into the nuts and bolts, the tools that we have to work with, and talk about three aspects of programming. First of all, the event. What is it that we can know about it? What information do we have as we start to develop a program? Secondly, the choreography. How much of that can we control? What kinds of things are known and available to us as tools in building a dance experience for our customers? And finally, the showmanship aspects of it. What kind of a show are we going to put on? What sorts of things are there to work with? Looking at the event factors, we can know quite a lot before we start to plan our program or as we develop the program. And let me point out at this point that many people in our business don't in fact ever write down a program, or if they do, it's at most a simple line that says, this is the call I'm going to use in this tip. That's certainly one way. There are many callers who have a good intuitive sense. They guess right. Those are the guys that get away with saying things to dancers that I couldn't even imagine saying to dancers. But they do it with a natural tone. Flippo gets away with things that I can't imagine any other caller getting away with. He does it because he has an incredible sense of what's right. I don't have that good fortune. Everything that I do at a dance, I have to think about. Nothing comes to me naturally. And so I'm one of those who plans very, very carefully. I go into considerable detail in deciding what I'm going to call when, which is, after all, the bottom line in programming. And I start by identifying the event. Is it a dance or a workshop? Is it a festival? Is this a one-time appearance for me? Is this a group I call for once a year, or do I call for them once a month? Or is this my regular weekly workshop group? How much experience do the dancers have? Sometimes I can know that, sometimes I can't know that. Not until I've started anyway. What do we know about the hall? Will I need a stand for the speaker? Will the acoustics be good? If the acoustics are good, I can get away with choreography that I can't use when the sound in the hall is bad. And finally, what is the advertised program? Or even, is there an advertised program? Sometimes there isn't. But if there is, then I want to know what it is so that I can stick to it. Sometimes I've run into the situation where the advertised program is one thing and the contract program is a different thing. Sometimes I run into a dance where the advertised program is one thing and what the club president called the other club that wanted to come visit is different. And I've had dances where I was hired to call a plus dance, but the president invited the mainstream club down the road to come and share the evening with them. It's useful to find that out before the middle of the evening. I didn't. It was the end of the third tip that somebody from the other club came and said, "I thought this was a mainstream dance." And I said, "I thought it was a plus dance." Wrong. Choreography, what can we know? First of all, let me push another button here. The CALLERLAB program, the advertised program. We can know what calls are available for us to use. With choreography, we can use all of those calls as one of the tools that we work with in developing a program. We want to provide variety. How do we provide variety? What is available to us for that? Many people think of variety as challenging choreography. Many of you have heard me argue the other side of that coin. I don't see it as difficult, I see it as different. I don't want the same routine twice in a row, but I don't want it to be difficult. I don't believe dancers know the difference between easy and difficult. What they know is I made it or I didn't. And so providing variety can be seen many ways. One interesting aside on that, many of you have heard that we ought to get 80% success. There are two ways of looking at 80% success. One is to say that 80% of the people succeed 100% of the time. And the other is to say that 100% of the people succeed 80% of the time. Those are very different dances. And we need to decide which we want. I used to settle for 80%. I don't anymore. My goal is 100% success 100% of the time. There are obvious problems. It's difficult. Controlling the difficulty of the choreography is the primary tool that I have in chasing that goal of 100% dancer success. And I'll have more to say about difficulty and what we've learned about it in just a minute. But the other factor that we have control over are the presentation aspects, our delivery style. How much of a showman are we? Some of us are natural showmen and do a great job of selling the program. Others don't do it quite so naturally, and I count myself in that category. We always have the choice at a dance of how much teaching will we do. Will there be a workshop tip? My personal preference is not to teach at a dance. I think that's the difference between a dance and a workshop. At a workshop, I teach. At a dance, I use the material the dancers know. I try to use it in varied ways. Another tool at my command is the music. We have marvelous music available to us, a great variety of it. We can increase the variety of our program by skillful use of that music that's available to us. Finally, the caller personality, the image that the caller projects. It's amazing for me to stand in a line at the end of the dance with another caller that I've worked with, and all the women come by and rush up to him and throw their arms around and kiss him, and then they come to me and shake hands. That's my image. That's how it is. Marshall Flippo, I'm not. But what the dancers expect from you, particularly dancers in an area where you're known, where they know you, what they expect from you has some impact on the dance you call. We can think of that more than just in our interpersonal interactions, the way we smile, shake hands, kiss, or whatever. Some of it is what they have come to know about us as callers. Some callers have a reputation for providing demanding choreography. Others are known as fun callers. I'm not sure exactly what these mean, but I suspect that the dancers coming through the door have an idea of what I'm going to do. It may also be that they have an idea of what this club's program is like. Some clubs are known as very serious. Students, I think was the word Shawn used. Others plan for the tourist, the environment, the social event. The dancing is a means to get people together. I called for a club in our area that I find very difficult because they are tourists first, foremost, and always. They, in fact, at the time I was calling this dance for them, had a school hall where the cafeteria was here and the gymnasium was where the dance was. There were 10 sets at the dance, and I never saw more than 5 on the floor at a time. They all stayed till the end of the evening. They weren't having a bad time. They just enjoyed talking to each other out in the cafeteria. That's a put down for me. But they were having a wonderful time. I went away thinking I'd called a terrible dance. They thought it was wonderful. I didn't interfere with their socializing. Something to keep in mind when we plan our program. I went back and called for that club again, reluctantly, because their caller's a good friend. And the second time I went back, I knew a lot more about their expectation. I did a much better job of calling for them because I did not interfere with their social happiness anywhere near as much as I did the first time. Both the caller's image and the club's image have a bearing on what we can do with our program, the tools that we have available. I mentioned difficulty, and I'd like to spend more time probably than that aspect deserves, because we have come to know a great deal more recently. We went for many, many years in the development of modern square dancing, recognizing that some of what we called caused trouble for dancers, and other things did not. And we didn't really understand very much why that was. If you'd called a long time, you knew that you could get away with this and you couldn't get away with that. But we didn't know why. And John Sobalski, whom some of you have seen wandering around here, has a very benevolent company that he works for, and they managed to give him a scholarship, in effect, what do you call it, a grant. They gave him 10% of his time to work on a research project of his choosing. And the one that he chose was to understand more about difficulty in square dancing. And he did come up with a paper on the subject. Bill Peters later tried to translate that so that the rest of us could understand it. Those of you who know John will know what I'm talking about. Finally, Bill got it put together so I could understand it, and I will try to pass on to you today what John Sobalski developed, certainly not in its complete form, but hopefully in ways that we can understand. It turns out that difficulty in square dancing relates to 10 factors. The first one is perfectly obvious. Everybody can figure out that if they don't know the call, it's tough. The second one is a familiar call, a call they know, but they don't do it very often. In the mainstream program, peel off has been that. Fan the top tends to be that way in many areas. Even though it's known, they were taught it, they don't hear it often enough to stay familiar with it. Another aspect of difficulty is the familiar call, but used in an unfamiliar formation. For those of you who use the Plus program, Track 2 is perfectly straightforward and simple as long as we have the girls together and the boys together when we start out. But reverse that, set up a different kind of arrangement. Wrong. I'm talking about arrangement, not formation. Formation. Do you all know the difference between arrangement and formation? Let us refresh your memory. Formation is the shape of the square. Peel off in its normal aspect is done from a double pass-through, a completed double pass-through formation. Another formation from which it can be used is the Z formation, the swing-through girls fold setup. Ends fold, sorry. That formation is less familiar for dancers than the usual formation for peel-off. That moves us quickly on to the next aspect, and that's the arrangement. Track 2 is a piece of cake if the girls and the boys are together in the usual position. Reverse sides and it gets more complicated. Put some girls and some boys in each pair and it gets a lot more complicated. The arrangement makes quite a difference. Follow your neighbor. Simple when the boys are facing in. When the girls are facing in, follow your neighbor becomes a very different degree of difficulty. Another aspect of difficulty results when we ask the dancers to remember too much. One way we do this is by stacking calls. We give them several calls. Happens often in singing calls. grand right and left, swing and promenade, and then we start singing. They've got to remember those calls. In a singing call, that's easy to do, but in patter, if we do the same thing, it gets much more difficult. Also, the gimmick that we use, one now, one later, asks the dancers to remember and adds to the difficulty of what they're doing. Next, we may ask them to keep track of too much. Many of our calls require dancers to know at all times, whether they are ends or centers, what their position is. Those who can do a right and left through is requiring the dancers to keep track of whether they can. Anticipation is an interesting one, because what we really mean here is doing something other than what they anticipate. We depend a great deal on dancer anticipation in order to make the action smooth, to flow well. One of the obvious ones, let me not say obvious, it took me 20 years to understand it, but one of the anticipations that we take for granted is the dive through or pass to the center, square through 3/4 to an Allemand left. Every dancer knows that is a very smooth action. You say, gee, that's one of the standard smoothies. The hand's available, but the body position is terrible. When you finish the pull by on the third hand of a square through 3/4, the people who are about to do an Allemand left with each other
are offset to the left so that their right shoulders are almost lined up. Every dancer instinctively sometimes using each song, circle to the left. How come we can't have a little variety, like say one singing call, okay, starting off with circle to the left, then the next song you do later on, say, okay, 40 of these chain, we're starting with a grand square. Not using the same thing all the time. Dancers have said this to me. I thought, very, very good point on that. Marking down, let's see. With thinking of the dancer, I like to say that this is their enjoyment, their recreation. We try to make dancing happiness for them at festivals. Same type of program we use there, thinking of the dancer. Sometimes we'll workshop a call in a room, and they'll say, okay, sometimes you can use that same call during the festival. Well, not true, because sometimes another caller, he'll come in, and he'll say, okay, now what did you just teach that last workshop tip, or that last workshop hour? And he'll say, okay, there are these such calls. But sometimes a caller has a certain following. When that caller leaves, there's a whole new group of dancers coming in, and that caller comes in ready to call that thing. They're all saying, where did you come from? And this has happened. We found this many, many times. That's how I like to program. I hope it's useful to you folks. And Jim, thank you very much for letting me table our programming and what I do for our clubs.
Jim manages to do all of that with just a list on the table. My list is a bit more complete, more detailed. What you see here on the screen is an evening's plan. The left-hand column identifies the theme material that I expect to use in each of the tips. And one of the reasons for doing this is to be sure that I get all of the calls, all of the major calls on the program, on the CALLERLAB program, included in the evening. And so those calls are not the limit of what I'll call. Just because those two are there, the trades and cloverleaf in the first tip, doesn't mean I don't use anything else. But it assures that I do use those, so that by the end of the evening I've used all of the calls that are listed there. This blank space is the space to write in the singing call. I used to plan singing calls as well, and I would put in the name of the singing call and pull out the records as I started the evening. I now do that, but I pull out the records, and I have a clear idea of what singing calls I want to use this evening. But I found that too often, when I finished the patter, the singing call record that I had already out wasn't the right one, and I had to go back into the case. So I quit writing it down in advance, and I leave a space to write it down afterwards, because I do keep a record of every dance I call. I have a calendar book with a full page for each day, and I write down the theme material and the singing calls that I use at every dance that I call. I have that collection going all the way back to 1959 when Ed Gilmore told me I should keep records. Another use that I've found for that book is to persuade the IRS of what my income is, because I write down how much I got paid and how many miles I drove to get to the dance. Some friends of mine who use the same program book for record keeping also write down what they and their partner wore, if they tend to wear matching outfits. Joanne and I don't do that, but some do, and it's helpful not to wear the same matching outfit back to the same club every other month. And so they keep those records as well. But this gives me the means to make the record that I need. With respect to the IRS, an interesting side story. They came many years ago to New England, and we have a magazine there called the New England Caller then. It's now the Northeast Dancer. But they took 3 years of the magazine and went through and listed all the dates that were advertised for each caller. They then called up the leading callers in the area, who were then Earl Johnston and Al Brundage, and said, "How much do you guys get paid for an evening?" The answer then was about $100. And so they came to those callers who had advertised and said, "We see that you called 23 dates in January. Would you show us why you didn't declare $2,300 of income for the month of January? Do you know how hard it is to prove that you did not get paid something? Proving that you did get paid may produce a check, but to prove that you did not get paid $100, hard to do." A lot of letters went scurrying around New England looking for receipts. They eventually discovered that square dance callers don't make any money, and they went away and haven't bothered us very much since. But the center column here is breaks. What I'm going to use as intermediate material, and I still tend to set a tip up very much on a singing call format. I do an introduction. I then call the theme material for heads and sides, and we'll put a break in and call the same or different theme material, again, for the heads and sides. And that's how I plan a tip. This tells me what to use for break material. And the next column is pizzazz and some other word there. I gave away my written copy of this thing, so I can't read. But the pizzazz is the gimmicks that I've collected over the years that provide variety, that provide the surprises, the unexpected. And those notes remind me of what to use so that I don't forget to use those gimmicks in the course of an evening. I find that if I don't have a written program, I go home thinking, "Gee, I forgot to use that thing. I had this great idea I was going to call, and I didn't get around to doing it." If I write it down, I'm more likely, not guaranteed, but more likely to get it in. And so I plan this evening. My evening's plan has gotten a whole lot prettier since my company provided me with a laser printer to go with my IBM PC. That's how I get this kind of result. But now it's very easy to just turn that out, and I've got my sheet and I mark it down. I also find that when I'm calling for the same group on a fairly regular basis, once every month or two, that it's very easy to just roll this program. My word processor lets me take the entire top block out and put it down on the bottom and move everything else up. And that prevents for me the problem that I discovered one night when a woman came to me at the dance and said, "Why do you always workshop tag the line in the third tip?" I hadn't realized I was doing that, but I went back and looked at my records, and she was right. The reason was at that time, tag the line was a new call, and I was workshopping it to make the dancers familiar, and the third tip was always my workshop tip. I am less reliable now. Also, I find that when I plan tips this carefully, I need to provide some tips that are not that carefully planned. And so every once in a while, I'll put into an evening's program a tip that isn't planned. Because those of us who are dedicated to plans sometimes get too predictable just because we make a plan. But I've discovered recently, and let me tell you how it came about. I've not been calling the advanced program very long. I started into A1, I think, 5 or 6 years ago, and only 3 or 4 years ago started A2, and I had not called an A2 dance. I'd done a class, several classes, and was doing a regular workshop program, but I had not called an A2 dance. And Baypath Barn, one of our prominent hotshot dancer locations in New England, called me to say, would I call an A2 dance for them? White-knuckled and all, I said yes. And then I set about making a tip plan for every tip, because I didn't dare go to that dance without a very clear idea of what I was going to call. I did make the tip plan, and it was so successful that I started making tip plans for each of the programs that I call. And it was, in fact, the mainstream program, this next page, which let me call for that tourist group that was so difficult for me, because it let me provide variety without overstepping their ability. Because I had available to me a list of variety I could know what to do that was easy for them. This is a tip plan. It starts off identifying what I'm going to use for introductory material. It identifies the figure routine theme material that I'm going to use for the first time through the figure. The break, ladies center, men sachet to an Allemande left. That's a tag the line variation that I use. If you start from a zero line and pass through tag the line face in, then ladies center, men sachet takes you to the Allemande left. It's a gimmick, and that's what I use there. The figure, wheel and deal, is the theme material, and the setups, the different ways in which wheel and deal can be done, both from lines and from two-faced lines, and the various things that one can do after a wheel and deal. Those are to remind me of the ways in which I can produce variety with that theme call. And finally, the pizzazz. If they're sharp, they'll get a look at that one. If they aren't, maybe not. And the other problem I have, I tend to use singing calls without too much regard for what the figure that came with it was, unless it's a really interesting, good figure. And so I want to remind myself of singing call figures so that I can plan the variety in them. This form of planning a program is in sharp contrast to what the intuitive callers are able to do. They can produce the great results that I'm striving for because they have a sense of what to do when. My sense has been unreliable for me, and so I plan much more than many do. I would suggest to you that this is one way to increase the variety of your program if you feel that's a useful thing and an important thing for you to do. Next, I'd like to give Shawn a chance to come back and tell you about an interesting aspect that he's picked up about programming from the television industry. And to wrap up our session, we hope we've provided interesting things for you. Shawn, would you take over for me?
Okay, one other source of interest for us comes from television programming. In this industry, strategic programming of time and content translate into viewer ratings. Viewer ratings for us could be considered the faithful dancers and the size of the crowd we attract. They help keep us in business. Television executives find some success in audience control by utilizing the LOP theory. Networks recognize that the content of a program may not be of a high artistic or intellectual caliber. However, a program may attain successful ratings if the program is less challenging to the audience's dominant value structure than what the other networks are offering in the same time slot. Hence, programmers try to present what is the least objectionable program to keep the broadest audience tuned in. One rather amusing criticism of television audience control methods I've come across was made by a former network executive. Illustrating the theory, the executive observed that if two medical programs were aired competing in the same time spot, say Marcus Welby and First Tuesday, both of these with the same storyline, a patient has contracted a social disease, the ratings would be higher for the credible Dr. Welby. Because when we watch Dr. Welby, we can anticipate an ending that is less challenging to our value structure, a happy one. Whereas if we were to watch the same patient on the less credible program, we would be risking an overwhelming attack of our dominant value systems. Or worse, we might contract the disease from watching the program. So our audience could be larger and more successful in the dance if we offer what is least objectionable to the majority. As programmers, we may wish to think about the value of the LOP theory. I would caution here that I believe that the LOP does not mean that we should program for the LCD, the lowest common denominator. A well-known hare once said to a young girl named Alice somewhere in Wonderland, "You might just as well say that I like what I get is the same as I get what I like." I believe that we run the risk of losing the majority of our dancers, prompting a condition of blind complacency, not only in the dancers, but in ourselves. We should opt for the LOP and not the LCD. Ultimately, then, what goals are we as artists and programmers striving for in terms of an aesthetic composition? We are seeking a unity of place. As a caller, you should seek a comfort with and meaning from the podium that you take. If the dancer finds a unity of place gained from a positive or profound experience, your program may well become a religious experience for them, the place becoming indistinguishable from the object and the transitional. And we do want a consistent audience. We want the dancers to keep coming back. You should seek a unity in action. The comfort and control with which you perform the act of calling will have an effect on your composition. For the dancer, the unity is revealed to them in the movement as well as the conceptual. You need to focus on providing them with the precise movement. And finally, as programmers, you seek to create a unity of time throughout the entire composition, that you might observe a coherent energy or flow during your performance. Successfully managed, the dancer will experience and remember this unity of time as a single perceptual moment. They will recall the atmosphere, the choreography, and the caller's performance. When the programmer has weaved all three aspects into his composition, he or she gives his composition value and meaning. Then your creation is not just a dance, but has become an event. Consciously manipulating the elements, the programmer can achieve an intended perception or perspective and draw attention to various forms of focal interest, acknowledging some simple basics within the total structure. The program, then, should not be thought of as an isolated element separate from your audience, but realized as a type of dynamic performance art, where the audience is participative as they move through your structure. Programming is a communication art. Here's your definition. Successful square dance programming is the effective control over the atmosphere, choreography, and transitional aspects of the caller's presentation into a cohesive composition for the dancer's entertainment. Thank you for your attention.
And put another way, that may say that we need to give them a good time, but there's a lot more to it than we thought before. We have just a few minutes left. If any of you have questions about specific programming issues or anything, we're game.
Question to you. You mentioned in the first tip that you give them a very easy slow tip. I was under a different impression that on the first tip, your speed may be a little faster, not much, but a little bit faster. The choreography might be a little more challenging, only because the rest of the evening then seems a little easier for them. Is there any truth to that theory? No, not really. Could be, yeah. I just, you mean like for like choreography-wise easier to the dancers, or does speed-wise, like dancing-wise? Yeah. Right. Good point. I never heard of, maybe Jim can,
I would take an opposite view. My theory on the opening tip is I want them to become familiar with me, with the place, to recognize that this is a safe place. I have the impression these days that dancers, particularly dancing to a caller they're not familiar with, someone they don't know, are very wary, that they are afraid. I think they've been burned many times. And so my approach to the opening tip is to make it as comfortable as I can, to establish my role as the host, as Shawn identified it, and to make sure that they are comfortable with that. Any other?
Jim, on the tip planning you had up there, do you have any handouts available on that?
I don't have handouts available. I will see if John will include something or make it available. Also, for anyone who wants to write to me, my laser printer does wonders, and so does my copier. Fine. Write to me, and I'll be happy to send you a copy. If you'd prefer to see the advanced program or the plus program, I have a similar thing for each of those. And that was a single tip within the evening. There is a backup tip plan for each of the tips in that mainstream program, as there is for each of the other programs. Yeah.
We want to leave a little room for variety in our planning. We never know what the round man viewer in between is going to want to put that happy feeling in street there, just before we were ready to start raising that crowd up and start pushing everything. I mean, it's August, and we might want to change our program a little and go into a little softer tip for a while until it moves down a little, and then we can get them with something different.
Certainly true that the circumstances change as the evening goes on, and we need to be sensitive to that. I can and have regularly skipped to a tip further down. All I do is write the number in the column on the margin so that I know that I did in fact not do it in the order it's shown. I did it in this numbered order. Always, this kind of a detailed plan runs the risk of not being possible to use. And the best program in the world will always be changed. Also, even with a detailed tip plan, there's a great deal of variation possible in the way you use that plan. The showmanship aspects of it are not written down. It's only the choreography aspects, the mechanics, the attitude with which you present it, and the way in which you sell it are not written down there. No.
I would tend to support, getting back to the first tip discussion, I would tend to support Jim and Jim. Because not only from the aspect that Jim was talking about where you're an unknown caller, but getting into a situation where you are the known caller, you call this group every week, I still feel that you have to physically warm the people up because they came in, they've been sitting in their cars, they have to get moving. If you're doing any sport, you have to warm up. If you're doing dancing, I think you have to warm them up. Also, their minds have not been thinking about square-throughs and Dixie Daisies and whatever. They've been thinking about what was going on during the day. Their minds have got to be turned around. So I would suggest that the first tip has to do that for you, and it would tend to be a smoother, an easier tip, one that they can get warmed up so you can now present your program that you have planned for the rest of the night.
There may be an exception to that in the big dance situation where you're the star and you want to establish that fact up front. I still think it's highly risky to use challenging choreography in that setting, but I might nudge up the tempo a little bit just to say, wow, here we are, as a showmanship delivery, but I would be very, very cautious of the choreography I use. We'll go back here first and then back to you.
I would just like to add for those, because of the age level seems to get a little bit higher each time, I don't think we should forget about the fact that people have had heart attacks and this type of thing. The first tip should be short and easy, not too long, because I think we have a tendency to get started, get rolling, and get everything going. So we forget about the poor guy who just been over the hospital maybe 5 months.
Certainly true that we need to be... People are trapped into the first tip. They don't know how long your tips are. Some callers run 20-minute tips, and somebody who came to a dance expecting a normal 10-minute tip might very well be in trouble, physical trouble.
Would the panel comment on how you would program your tip in a visitation situation or a festival where you're on once and then that's all they see of you? Could you comment on those?
Lots of rehearsal. Okay. basically, if I've only got one shot, I want to give them my best, number one. I'm not going to throw anything that's too complex. Everything is standard. Because if you've got one shot, what you want to accustom them to is just building the enthusiasm. They want to know you as a friend. I don't believe that choreography is what they're going to go away remembering. They're going to remember the performance. So if it's a one shot, make them walk away happy.
I would add to that only to use a singing call that they can go away singing.
I agree exactly with what Shawn says.
No disagreement there.
I have two comments, if I may. If I could comment on the festival aspect too, aside from why don't I just come up here and use this? All right. If I could comment on the festival aspect, aside from the terror factor on the part of the caller up on the stage, you want to give them the very best impression of yourself that you can. And you do that, as far as I'm concerned, by making sure all the people possible can enjoy the dance. If they don't get through it, they don't care who you are or what you did. If they get through it, then they'll pay attention to how good a job you did and how well you sounded. And as far as the regular programming, if you don't start out in such a way that you familiarize the dancers with who you are and how you work and how you sound, if you go right into the challenge and the hot tempo at the beginning, what do they have to look forward to the rest of the evening? Why don't they just go home?
I think the festival situation goes straight back to Shawn's identification of the least objectionable program. That's certainly a situation where I think that applies. That's not the place where I'm going to tempt them or I'm going to test them, because I don't have any opportunity to go back and fix it. If I got an evening to work with them, I can run greater risks than I can when I have one tip. Any other questions? Yes.
My name's Kathy Villa, and I'm from Newark, California. I was wondering what you did when you thought it was a plus dance and they thought it was a mainstream dance. What do you do when there's different expectations about what the program is?
Good question. My response to that is always to let the club make the decision and announce it. If they want me to continue calling a plus dance, as my contract said, then I send them to talk to the person who questioned me, the representative of the club. In that instance, they decided they really had invited this mainstream club, and they wanted me to call a mainstream dance, and I asked them to announce that because they had invited a mainstream group, that they have asked me to change the dance to mainstream. I didn't have any objections. I didn't have any complaints from the floor. We dance in an area where people have not driven a long way. The much tougher situation is where you've been hired to call a plus dance, and in fact the home club are not very good plus dancers, or they have invited the neighbors who are mainstream dancers in, but there's a square that doesn't get to dance plus very often, and so they've driven 200 miles to come to this dance because it was advertised plus. Much harder choice.
A good point on that, too. Sometimes if a situation like that, what we would do, I would say, if the committee approves of it, maybe do tip for tip. So, okay, since you got a situation like this, so you do time your tips out, have a mainstream tip, and do a plus tip. Then do a mainstream tip and a plus tip. We do this at home with our programs, and it works very successfully. Just great. And I forgot to mention something earlier, too, about programming. I like to have two programs, a program A and a program B. Sometimes at home I'm programming my evening's dance performance, and you get to the dance, and you're also to call these calls, and all of a sudden, things in the first or second tip, things aren't working out too well. The dancers are just not with it, and the things you want to do is just not going. It could be a full moon, or something's just not working out. So that plan A, it's gone. I'll use it next week, and then so plan B comes in hand. We're just dance some, have fun, go with